Okay. Hi, Dad.
Hi, Laura.
So we're here today. We're here today to have our first recording session talking about life stories and growing up in Indiana and any place we want to take it. So it's December 8th, 2024, and I'm really excited to start this project with you.
Yeah, well, I'm
Thanks for being
excited.
here.
I've
Um,
wanted to figure out a way to record some of this for family, but this beats writing it up.
well, in the great Buzard tradition, as verbal people, I think this is a good technique to capture some stories and some material. So I wanted to start with a question, something I've always been curious about, because throughout my childhood, and I've always known that you wanted to be a lawyer since you were in second grade. And
Third,
many third grade, okay, third grade. Many people don't know what they want to do for much of their lives, especially not in their childhood. So I'm curious, if you could give some context of how you knew that when you
sure,
were in third grade.
sure. Well, my Grandpa McGuire was very important in my early years, and he was mayor of the town, and I wanted to be like Grandpa. He gave me a history book, Makers of America. And I noticed that I wanted to be a politician like Grandpa, but I noticed that all the politicians that made it anywhere were generally lawyers. So I thought that I should go to law school to be a lawyer, and then I could go into politics like Grandpa. So when I'm speaking to young lawyers and others, I say I kind of drifted until the third grade, and then I figured out what I wanted to do. So, as it turned out later, I liked the law a lot more than I thought I would. I had no way of knowing, so stayed on, never really ran for office, but it was to be like my grandpa.
Tell me more about your grandpa.
Well, he was, as I say, he was mayor of the town when during that period.
And
Um,
that was Sullivan, Indiana.
that was Sullivan, Indiana, where he had been editor of the local newspaper, and then bought his own newspaper, and then ran for mayor in about 1940. Um, so I thought it was neat that when we go into town, people say "Morning, Mayor, Morning, Mayor." He's very imposing. I mean, he didn't have a regal bearing, but I mean, he was tall and always in those days wore a suit and tie, and to him, a casual outfit was an old suit and tie because the casual clothes weren't really invented until the war. So this was shortly after the war. He had a 1942 Packard, which he loved driving around town. He was a very easygoing person. He had a Hudson before that, and I remember driving to Merrim, and the gear shift kind of broke off, and
Oh, wow.
he kept driving, singing, "Bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves."
I
Uh,
remember you singing that song when I was a child, but I never knew where that came from.
is that right? I did.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
you
well,
passed that
it's not
along.
commonly used except for that context. He sang in the choir. The life revolved somewhat around First Baptist Church, where his father had been the minister and his uncle had been the minister. But he sang. There was a coal mining town, and it was like a war. Most coal mining families had lost somebody in a coal mining
Mm.
accident. Well, there was an explosion in city mine, and he sang at 32 funerals in one
Wow.
week. That was before my time. But he was a well-loved figure. The story was that there was a firefighter killed in a city fire, and he or he made sure that the widow had money for her dress. But he was very charitable. I also remember he was not judgmental. He sent me to get my hair cut. I probably was I don't know, 7 or 8. Somewhere along the way, I went to a store. I couldn't find my dollar, so I called for my haircut. So I called up my grandpa crying, and he said, "What's the matter?" I said, I explained to him. He said, "Well, you're not the first person to lose a dollar." So that
Yeah.
made me feel
Help
that,
calm you down.
yeah, made me feel much better. I remember I had kind of an awakening of interest about the fourth grade. And I remember asking him a whole bunch of questions, and he said, "Well, stop being so inquisitive." And I said, "Well, what does inquisitive mean?" But anyway, my parents were divorced by then, and I think he felt sorry about that, and kind of took me under his wing. He had had only daughters, 5 daughters, and so I think, well, my older cousin was a male, but I was the only other male at this point. And I think he felt sorry. He tried to arrange um, friends to take me fishing. It never worked out. But and he was also wanted me to try to teach me to throw a baseball. He really was concerned about me, and I was pretty serious at the time. But
And
he was quite a figure in town and quite a figure in my life. And then very sadly, he uh, died when I was 10. My last memory of him was my aunt and uncle were taking me up to visit for a few days. It was right after Christmas, and him standing on the door there on the porch waving as we left, and
mm,
uh, that was the last time I saw him. And then the word came in that he'd had a stroke about a day later. We
wow.
hightailed it down to Sullivan, and then he was in the hospital. And then I remember my mother coming in and telling me that Grandpa died. She was totally broken up because she and my mother and her father were very close, and I really didn't know what to make of it. Of course, we were very sad, but I probably would have been more relaxed about stuff if he had lasted more than
Yeah.
10 years because he was a he was an easygoing guy.
Yeah. It sounds like he helped you kind of get
He did.
perspective on things
He
you
did.
know, see things more clearly. Yeah.
He
Yeah.
did.
So you were 10, so that was your probably your first experience with the death of someone close to
Yes,
you.
it was for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When he ran for mayor, did he have competition or was he the guy?
Yeah, he was. That was kind of a too bad thing. I was never involved in his campaigns. Of course, I was very young,
Hmm.
but he running for a third term, he lost, and
Mm.
uh, I know that really made him feel badly. That would have been about, oh, probably 1950.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the things about you mentioned that you liked being a lawyer and you did go into politics. And I guess one of the things about politics is that,
You could.
you're at the whim of the voter and those kinds of things.
Well, the other thing that would influence me was uh, he was involved in everything. He was president of the school board and president of Rotary and president and exalted ruler of
Hmm.
the Elks. I mean, his view of being in a community was to be involved. And of course, I felt the same way. I wanted to be involved like he was, and I wanted a city that I could be involved in, but
Yeah.
city, something where something more was going on. But
Right.
he gave me a sense of community involvement.
That's really interesting because I've heard a lot about him, but I never knew that that was a through line for your community involvement, which has also been very influential on me, I would say.
Oh,
So
well,
that's
yeah,
that's
right.
neat to learn that connection and that because when somebody models that, when you notice that,
Oh, sure.
it makes it so influential when you're a child.
Yeah, well, that's very good. Everybody knew him, and I certainly had a sense of service.
Hmm. So when he became mayor, he didn't have the newspaper anymore?
Oh, no, he
He
kept the newspaper.
Oh, he did.
Not only did he keep the newspaper,
A little bit of a conflict of interest in the journalism
well, there's a
perspective, but
bigger one. He was, it wasn't exactly. a digging newspaper. It was
Right, right.
well, his newspaper was the Sullivan County Democrat, and he not only printed the newspaper, but he also printed the paper ballots. He got
Oh,
to
wow.
print
Wow.
the paper ballots, and one of his perks of being in politics was he also was designated to head up the state license branch in Sullivan. So all the girls worked in the license branch.
His daughters, you
Made
mean,
a,
those girls? Yeah,
he never made much, never made a lot of money, but enough to
yeah,
support a family.
yeah. So, can you talk a little bit more about Sullivan, Indiana, and describe it? This sort of, I think of it as kind of an Americana small town with a main
Well, it
street.
was
Is that correct? Yeah.
certainly my world. It was about 5,000 people in southwestern Indiana between Terre Haute and Evansville. Uh, Heavy coal mining and farming, but coal mining predominated. It had everything I thought that a town needed. It had two theaters, one where they showed First Run and the other
Mm.
where they show Westerns and Tarzan movies, double headers, double features. I go to both, and of course, great cartoons and
Oh,
news
yeah.
and movie news. Uh, but there were a couple of men's stores, and about every street had a corner grocery. Um, a lot of churches, important town square. People would go up to the town square on Saturday night and just eat popcorn and watch other people walking
Oh,
around.
really? Wow.
But downtown was really, it was a square, and it was really the center of business for the town. I carried newspapers, so and I different times I had a good part of the city on each route, but some were more than others, and so I knew about every house in town, and they were all for the most part well maintained. Usually 3 bedroom was a big house. Typical house was 2 bedrooms, and
Two stories or single story.
both. Sometimes there was a bedroom on the bedroom or two on the second floor. A lot of both. Probably about all of them at that point. Later there were new houses, but they were built in the teens and 20s. I used to get a kick. They started putting aluminum storm doors on the house. So, and I was throwing folded Terre Haute papers. So I got a kick out of trying to make a bang when I threw my paper and hit the aluminum kick panel. Made a lot of tips. Um,
Or was there a certain sound that you were trying to get when you would throw the
just a
paper?
bang.
Yeah,
But
that's
as
funny.
far as I was concerned, to me, there was everything there you would need. There were dry goods stores and there were car dealers, Ford, Chevy, and Cadillac, Oldsmobile, Hudson, Dodge, um, a couple of drugstores, 2 or 3 banks, but it was a very self-contained town. If you wanted something uh, fancier or more selection, you'd go to Terre Haute, which was about 25 miles north,
Hmm.
town of about 60,000. And if you really wanted something high hat, you'd go to Indianapolis to get it. And
Wow.
then
And how
really,
far away was the drive to Indianapolis? How far was the how yeah, how or
about two and a
distance or
half
time?
hours. There was
Hmm.
a 4 lane between Terre Haute and Indianapolis, but it was not limited access. So, there'd be side streets coming out. You had to be careful.
Mm.
And you went right through the center of every town. And that was Highway 40, and that was the same highway that you would take to go east to Washington, for example. Highway 40 is very important. Um, but it was, I had the feeling that it was self-contained, that it was really
Hmm.
uh, what you needed.
You had what you needed. Yeah.
There was school consolidation at the time. School consolidation had been delayed because every town wanted to have its own uh, basketball team, and like from Hoosiers,
Right. Sure. Yeah.
everybody, and so they realized that if there was school consolidation, uh, Johnny would probably not make first five, and he might not
Mm,
be on the team, and the town wouldn't be represented. So with school consolidation, that really did change the identity of towns by taking away the schools. And I remember in English class we were doing essays, and the one guy who'd been transferred in from Graysville, which is kind of a little crossroad town, but it had its own high school. And he wrote a paper about the relative advantages and disadvantages of a big high school where he was then, uh,
uh-huh.
and the school he came from.
Wow.
The school he was in is probably 500 people, and the school he came
Yeah.
from was maybe 100.
Yeah, that's interesting that basketball and the identity of the small municipality really drove people's feelings about that.
Well, and it's all summed up in the movie Hoosiers.
Hmm.
The thing of it was that reflected in Indiana's attitude was small towns versus cities.
Right.
So, as depicted in Hoosiers, it was true. Muncie Central was a big, Muncie probably wasn't even 100,000, but they always
Yeah.
they were a city and had a basketball team.
Right.
But if you beat Muncie Central, that was big, and that's what happened in Hoosiers. And the preacher at the Baptist church at the time was from Milan, which is the movie version of what was from Milan, which was depicted in the movie as Hickory.
Right.
And I remember when Milan beat Muncie Central, uh, the preacher just was wildly ecstatic. But the
Yeah.
point was kind of the leveling of, we're as good as they are. There were no classifications or divisions for small schools or middle. Everybody, Milan could go against Muncie, and there's something kind of egalitarian about it. Just
Yeah.
like judges didn't wear robes.
Mm.
They were not any better than anybody else, and so they shouldn't don't need a robe.
Interesting. Yeah. So do you think that's an Indiana ethos?
What's that?
Do you think that
Oh,
ethos
I
is
do. Oh,
particular
I
to
do. Oh,
Indiana?
yeah, oh, yeah. Rural. I mean, kind
Hmm.
of uh, city versus rural. I remember that when I was working in Terre Haute, working construction summer, relatives from Indianapolis would just say, be very careful about being in Terre Haute because they thought it was dangerous. And then when I was working in Indianapolis, people from Terre Haute, oh, well, be careful. It's dangerous in Indianapolis.
That's so funny because that made me think of a story, Grandma Becky thing. Your mother, Grandma Becky, would always laugh because I wanted to lock the doors of cars. Like it was like a running gag, and it really encapsulates what you're talking about because there
Oh,
was a
yeah.
little bit of like we're in a safe area. You don't need to worry about that here.
They
You
wouldn't
know, and
even leave the keys in the ignition.
yeah, yeah.
That way
She
they
just
didn't have to
now I
try to
understand a
find
bit
it.
more why she thought that was so hilarious
Yeah, yeah, it
that I
was. I
wanted
remember
to lock the door.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
I'd
I
like,
think, it was hard, really. I don't know whether it still is, but it was hard for somebody from Indianapolis to win a statewide office because people didn't want city people. They wanted somebody from a
sure.
small town.
I wanted to go back to your days as a newspaper carrier.
Yeah.
And were you delivering your grandfather's paper?
No, his was in the mail. Uh,
Okay,
I uh, I carried the Terre Haute papers.
got it.
There was a Sunday edition, included a rotogravure. I don't know if you've ever seen a rotogravure. It's
No.
brownish pictures of weddings and such
Oh,
forth.
wow.
Anyway, uh, there was a morning and evening. Morning was the Star, and the evening was the Tribune. And at various times, I'd carry one or the other. The Tribune morning paper, I mean the Star, the morning paper was more popular. I started doing that. I was particularly eager to carry papers because with my parents divorced, um, mother didn't have any money, and my dad sent 18 bucks a week for my brother and I. And as far as he was concerned, he had discharged his duty and he didn't have any money. So I learned at that age I really didn't like asking people for money. So if I had my own paper route,
Hmm.
later working in a grocery, that I didn't have to ask people for money. I had my own
Hmm.
money. I had enough to buy. I bought my own clothes, and always tried to save enough, put money in the savings bank for college. But having my own money, I found gave me a great independence. And people would Christmas time they'd uh, tip me, or if they didn't have
Hmm.
money, they give me fudge or candy.
Oh, fun.
They
Yeah.
had money, they give me maybe maximum $5. But
Yeah.
I ended up with 30, 40 bucks in Christmas tips, which I would often use to buy a new sport coat or something.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Or
Even back
part in
then.
the bank, part into clothes. And in those days, of course, I was not able to not able to drive yet. That was when I was 12 to 15 probably. And so it was all on a bicycle.
I was going to ask you to describe a little bit
It
what
was a
that.
bicycle, and my
And would you
mother,
get up early in the morning and go pick up papers? Tell me about how
yeah,
that worked.
go pick up papers. There was a guy who actually folded them for us, so all I had to do was put them in the bag. My mom, who tended to exaggerate and improve stories, would talk about. I'd come home and there would be icicles coming off of the cap of the bill of my cap. Just sort of true, I suppose, but she wanted to make it heroic. And then um, I started working in the Buzard Brothers furniture store when I was about um, 11 or 12. I couldn't figure out. My dad called me up and said, I want you to come and work at the store. Well, I hadn't been around him much, so I wanted to grab that opportunity, but I couldn't figure out why out of the blue. And the best thing I could figure out was I was with some guy at a gas station and told him that, Jesus, it'd be fun to work at this gas station. So I think the family swooped right in
Yeah.
and uh, got me work at the store. And they paid me $2 a week. I think it was basically to keep me out of gas stations, but well, and also to make me part of the family family business.
Hmm.
But my dad was very hard to work for, very, very, very demanding. I mean, he was, and he couldn't really. There was usually some other more conventional paid worker there, but he couldn't raise hell with them. But he could raise hell with me or his parents if something went wrong. So that there was always, I mean, there was often something that he could find that I needed correction on. And he thought he was also teaching me how to work. So I didn't get days off. I was only 11 or 12.
I was going
Uh,
to ask. So, were you doing the newspaper at the same time you did that, or did you
well,
leave newspaper
that
behind?
was kind of where I was headed. Yes, there was a bus that ran from Terre Haute to Evansville, Arrow bus line. And there was a bus station not far from the store. Dad would take me to work in the morning. And then about 3:30, 4 o'clock, I'd head up to the bus station and for a quarter, get a ride to, at that point, we lived pretty close to the bus, over the road that the bus came in on. So the bus would stop near the crossroads where we lived, and I'd go get my bike and go carry papers. Uh, and I
And you would
learned.
do the,
Mhm.
I was just going to say you would do the paper route before school.
No, I wouldn't work at the store in the winter,
I see.
only
So
in the
you're talking
summer.
about summer break from school. Got
Yeah,
it.
so, but papers I carried out year round.
Year round. Got it.
But there wasn't a lot of, if we had one big snowstorm a year, that was a lot.
Hmm.
And I would look forward to that, of being out of school and going sledding. But it didn't
Yeah.
happen. Now, there
Yeah.
were icy days. I mean, it was tough riding a bicycle and tossing papers when it was icy. Uh, but I was able to do it.
How many papers would you do a day, do you think?
Maybe 70 or 80.
Well,
If I had a big route, maybe 100.
yeah. So you really got to know the neighborhoods and the houses, like you
I
mentioned.
knew every neighborhood in town and
Yeah.
every house in town. In those days, they were pretty well maintained. I mean, it was a poorer section of town,
Hmm.
but Depot Town, I never had a route in Depot Town.
Hmm.
The rest of my routes were in working people's houses,
Hmm.
and they were for the most part maintained. And I kept
Hmm.
track of what car they drove, and
I'm sure. Yeah.
uh, it was different because very few divorces. So that is in, and I to digress a little. My mother worked for a real estate agent for quite a while. So he would rent us a house but it was one kind of once a year we'd move. And
Hmm.
so we moved from one end of the town to the other every year.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Yeah.
and so I attended both grade schools. And of course I knew the neighborhoods from doing that as well, from living in all of them really.
That makes
After my
sense. Yeah.
grandpa died, we moved in with my grandma,
Hmm.
um, which was pretty nice house, two-story. Um, and then I would come home and have lunch with her. And then when she died, they sold the house, and that house was sort of the center of my universe as far as I was concerned.
Hmm. Hmm. That makes sense. So you mentioned Buzard Brothers Furniture. So can you give a little more context for where that was and what that was?
Sure, sure. My grandpa Buzard, I was son of a foreman in a coal mine in a town called Linton, uh, it's about 15 miles from Sullivan. And he was a hard worker in high school, worked in a bank and had various offers. I don't think much thought was given to him to go to college. Uh, but he met my grandmother, who was from a better off farming family. She was first generation German. Last name was Lutz. So they got married, and his first and only job they ever had. I mean, well, Grandpa worked some as a kid, but as an adult, their only job was they bought a furniture store in Shelburne, which was about 6 miles north of Sullivan, an existing furniture store, and went up there and took it over with his brother Willie. That's why Bizarre Brothers.
Got
And
it.
uh,
So they renamed it obviously when they bought it.
what's that?
They renamed the store when they bought it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Bizarre Brothers. It was
Hmm. I
what,
didn't
what,
realize that they bought an existing. I didn't know that. That's
yeah,
interesting.
they
Yeah.
bought it from um, my grandma's uncle,
I
and it
see.
was a little town, also coal mining, but it had a movie theater and another small town kind of place, movie theater and furniture store and drug store. I mean, it had the high school.
Hmm.
It had all the basics, but people would, particularly when my dad came back and ran the thing, people would come up from Sullivan to buy stuff. But the main customers were miners and farmers around the town, and Grandpa carried his own paper, by which I mean if somebody needed to buy a piece of furniture, which they typically did, on time, he would he didn't send them to a finance company. He'd take payments from them, no interest.
Oh,
So
wow.
people, I remember people coming in with their little books and scratching off
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
$2 or $5 payment. But the thing I have to give him great credit for was uh, he sold furniture and appliances from through World War One, and then the Depression, when the first thing people quit buying is furniture and appliances in a depression.
Sure.
Then during World War Two, he couldn't get stoves, which they sold, and he couldn't get furniture or springs because they couldn't get steel. Um, but he raised two kids, my dad and his sister. Um, very hard. I mean, that was hard uh,
Mhm.
because if the and their mines would go out if the miners were big strikers, and sometimes demand for coal go down. So there'd be time when the mines would go out, and you'd have a depression, so people wouldn't pay their bills, and somehow they made it. My dad said that whenever he wanted something uh, that would mount anything, my grandpa would say, "Well, it depends on what the mines do." Then my
Right.
dad realized that
Sure.
that was just a dodge that grandpa was just using that as a stall from buying him what it was he wanted.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's interesting because that sort of boom and bust cycle and the adjacent businesses, happens today. Um,
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, there was no boom or bust. I mean, this was that was the ultimate boost, the depression.
yes,
Then
for
I
sure.
found out there was a guy, a nice looking older guy, that we passed him and his house, and Dad and Grandpa both just talked about how much uh, they disliked him.
Mm.
And the reason was he had been the town banker, but was stealing cash out of the bank so that Grandpa kept what he called his store cash, that is the cash that he used to operate the business, kept some in the safe, but then took the rest to the bank, sort of like Wonderful Life.
I was going to say, yes, that
Oh,
reminds me of that.
totally.
Yeah.
So, except this didn't turn out well. Not only was there a depression, people weren't paying their bills, but the banker stole his
Wow.
store cash. But
Wow.
he still made it.
Wow.
It was uh, Grandpa's attitude was to pretty much sell everything. They had furniture and Philco refrigerators and Speed
Hmm.
Queen washing machines and Hoover sweepers, and uh, he would sell anything along that line that was needed in the home. Uh, and also, Dad said that Grandpa and his brother, they call him Willie or Wooly, uh, would do picture framing, and
Mm.
uh, they would charge for the materials, but they didn't count their time. So
Oh, wow.
they weren't really making any money. They were just selling materials. And my dad was much more efficient that way when he came back to the store.
So when did your dad start running the store full time? In the
Well,
50s
Grandpa,
or?
our dad, I'll back up just a minute on that. Dad was really an engineer by training. And when the war was just getting going, or they knew that the war was coming,
Hmm.
Allison's, which made airplane engines, was hiring. So he went to work there right out of college and became test foreman, very hard worker. And
Hmm.
so he worked at Allison's during the war, and then we moved us to Washington, and he again operated in plants. Uh,
Washington, Indiana or Washington?
and no,
Yeah.
just Yeah,
Yeah,
about 40 miles away. I
got it.
lived on the other
Just
side of
wanted to
the.
clarify.
Yeah, right. So he always double production was very successful, but it was hard because he would say to me, nobody wanted to work as hard as he did. Well, nobody wanted to work as hard.
Yeah,
So I think my parents at that point were having problems. So I think they moved, we did move back to Sullivan, and I think it was partially to solve that issue. And so Dad started working there in uh, probably 47.
okay.
Uh, and then gradually took over more and more of the duties. At that point, Grandpa was kind of winding down. It wasn't that, he's probably 60, but he'd been doing it for a long time.
Sure.
And they had a 27 Chevy delivery truck. Grandpa had never
Oh, wow.
gotten a new delivery truck. So we were going to Sullivan, which is about 6 miles away. We'd have to stop and get water on the way on the truck. So Dad got
Wow.
a new truck, and then Dad started advertising
Mm,
big time in the Sullivan Daily Times, which is what my grandfather, father on
I
the other
see. I
side,
see.
had been an editor, but we had long been out of that paper. So that would really produce a business. He ran anniversary sales and mattress sales, and it always had the number of years that the store had been in business. At that point, it's probably 35 years.
Yeah.
Uh, but it was Dad would get them in the store, but Dad would want to go to work selling them something. But my grandpa wanted to talk about the old days rather than
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
one of the things they sold was there were no gas lines through there. So if people wanted a gas furnace or a gas uh, stove, gas water, or any of those things,
Sure.
you had to have propane gas,
Hmm.
which came in tanks, which
Yeah.
uh, Dad would deliver. But my grandma also worked in the store and sold stuff. Had a pretty good salesman. So
You're talking about Lulu Lutz, right?
Lulu. So
Yeah.
Dad heard Grandma giving a great spiel about the advantages of a gas range, and Dad was listening and said, "Boy, she had memorized his spiel." So he thought that was really great. So the prospect said, "Well, Mrs. Buzard, how do you like your gas range?" So, oh, I don't have a gas range. Scares me to death. So that was the end of that. So what there was we had a routine because I did work there summers. We had a routine where uh, Grandma and Grandpa would no Grandpa would come over first after breakfast to the store and get it open. Then Grandma would clean up the from the breakfast, come to the store and sell and uh, yeah, basically sell. That was her job. So the store was maybe a block and a half from um, their house. So 11:30, she would head from the store back to the house to cook what she called dinner, and it was dinner. I mean, it was
Mm,
big.
mm,
Uh, Supper was later.
I
Uh,
see.
cook dinner for us, and then Grandpa and Dad and I would. Then she'd come back to the store to cover the store while we went home to eat dinner
Mm.
and take naps.
I was going to say you might be tired after a big meal in the middle of the day.
Well, there was yeah, but that was solved by napping,
Yeah, that makes
which I
sense.
do to this day.
Yes.
And I discovered that I better get in and get to sleep first because when Grandpa particularly started snoring, I couldn't sleep. But we'd all three be in there sleeping and snoring. They took the Saturday Evening Post, which Grandpa did, so I would take I always wanted to read a little of that. Then I
Hmm.
tried to go to sleep, and then there was a clock, and I remember looking at that clock, oh gosh, it's 1:15, I'm gonna have to leave in 15 minutes. But so then we go back, and then Grandpa would uh, and Dad and I would go back to the store. Grandma would come home, clean it up, and then we go back to her, and then she'd go
Tag
back.
team. Yeah.
But one of the things that Dad talked about, even when in his last days, he Grandma was tending the store, and a guy walked in named said it's John Myers, and I don't think Grandma realized that he was the member of Congress from that area.
Oh,
Anyway,
wow. Wow.
he was paying a call, and Grandma said, "Well, he's home taking a nap." And so when my dad found out that he
No.
missed talking to John Myers, uh, and Grandma told him he was taking a nap, but he'd be back in about a half an hour, he was just fuming. So the
I bet.
a funny sequel to that was years later when I was chairing or the MC at a Republican dinner. I knew our local congressman was bringing John Myers to Rochester. Uh, so when I told him, uh, and he was a Republican, I told him, uh, I walked up and said, "I'm Vince Buzard from Sullivan," and I knew he was a congressman. He said, "How did you get out here?" He was amazed that there's this kid from Sullivan who was now in Rochester, and I introduced him. And so the next day, my mother's phone was ringing and ringing, and it was John Myers, who was back in
Hmm.
Indiana. Said, "I ran into your boy out in
Oh my
Rochester,"
gosh.
and so they completed
She
this.
must have loved that. Wow.
Oh, sure. Even though he was a Republican.
Yeah, right, right. But that seems
Yeah,
like that would
yeah.
be up her street.
She loved that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he got a big kick out of it. It was awfully nice of him.
Yeah. That's great. That's a fun. Yeah, it's funny how it can feel like a small world sometimes, and that's an
Oh, it
example of
is.
that.
But
Yeah.
to see those, uh, just to see the startled look on people's face when you're telling them,
Yeah.
I would get the same effect at the American Bar Association. I'd always make it a point to look up the Indiana delegation,
Yeah.
introduce myself. New York, what are you doing way out in New York?
Yeah, you're sort of a member of an unofficial club or something, it seems like
Yeah,
when you grew up in Indiana and you've gone someplace
yeah,
else.
oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, interesting. That would be a good topic for maybe our next talk is the transition from, this life that you're describing to, leaving Indiana and that kind of thing.
Oh, sure. One of the guys who was a per people whom my humor comes from a fellow named Roger Brannigan, who was president of the Indiana State Bar and later governor. Very funny guy. And one of his jokes was there was a guy who moved from Indiana to Kentucky and increased the IQ of both states. Because there's a big rivalry, but there's kind of sort of like ethnic jokes. People from Indiana make fun
Yeah,
of people from Kentucky. They're right next door across the river.
right, right. That is so funny. That's interesting. That reminds me of that's a corollary to the city versus rural
Oh
rivalries too,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
totally, totally.
yeah. How funny. When you worked at the furniture store, what did you do?
Oh, I swept, uh, dusted the furniture and appliances that get dusty.
Uh-huh.
Um, maybe occasionally wash the front windows. Um,
Help move stuff around, I would guess maybe.
huh?
Would you help move things or unpack things when they would arrive or anything
Oh
like
yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah. That was always a big day when stuff would come in,
Yeah,
and we'd unpack them and put them together. That was a favorite time. Or I'd go with Dad on deliveries. I mean, that was my favorite part because I really got closer to him. But sometimes I'd be invited. Sometimes he'd take the hired guy. But
yeah.
uh, uh,
So would
one
you, so when you would go on a delivery, so someone would come into the store, they would buy, say, a sofa or a
refrigerator,
table, fridge, and
yeah,
then the Bizarre Brothers would take that truck that you described and
yeah.
deliver it. And actually, so you'd actually get to go inside some of the houses that you had
Oh
probably
yeah.
delivered papers to as well, right? That must have been
Oh
cool.
yeah. Well, yes. A lot of those people didn't have forced air furnaces, so they also sold. The Zarbers also sold stoves, great big cast iron things.
You mean
That,
heating stoves,
huh? Heating,
stoves that would heat your house. I see.
you
Hmm.
know, well, greatly heat the room it was in, and then
Yes.
uh, it
Yes.
was on a stove board, and they used coal, of course, and they
Sure.
sold those. Uh, so there wasn't anything real fancy about most of the houses. The only thing that got things fancier was oil was discovered in the area.
Oh, interesting.
And that was so people who had, been pretty poor all of a sudden have money and they would order some furniture, but good furniture. But
Hmm.
one woman I remember particularly, she liked the oil but hated the fact that the drillers would pile up her garden, as they were coming in and out. But they made,
Uh-huh.
and the interesting thing in those days, the gas that was on top of the oil was considered a nuisance.
Mm.
So they would burn that off, just
Oh,
burn it.
wow. Wow.
So if you
Wow.
go out in the country and you'd see these derricks with fires on top where they were burning
Wow.
off the gas to get to the oil.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah,
Pollution and using a resource that could have, that is valuable. Yeah.
that's right. The other thing about the store that I remember vividly was there was not it was an outdoor privy. It was a privy, which is outdoor by
Right.
definition.
Right.
Not a
Wow.
very pleasant place to be. So
Yeah.
there was a salesman that came through all dressed. This was middle of summer, all dressed up. Grandpa was the buyer, and he was very conservative in what he bought.
Hmm.
So this guy was uh, trying to sell Grandpa something, and he just wasn't doing it. The guy was doing everything cartwheel, but Grandpa wasn't buying. So finally, the salesman said, "Well." I need to go to the bathroom. Where is that? So they said, Vince, take him. My dad's nickname for the privy was the Rose Room, which
Uh-huh.
was the name of a ballroom from a Chicago radio station. So he called this the Rose Room, and it definitely didn't smell like roses. So I took him out, pointed to the privy out back. He came back. The guy came back a little bit later, and his tie was down, and he was sweating through. He said, "Boy, it's really hot down there." Packed up his stuff, and that was
He
the
was out of there.
that was the end of the traveling sale. That traveling salesman at Buzard.
That's funny. Well, I have one thing I wanted to share with you, and I think we can close. I think we've covered a lot of territory here, but I can remember very vividly Grandpa Allen, your father, driving me in Indiana and pointing out the mines, the mines to me. And I,
Finding
didn't
out
really
the what?
the mines, like the strip mines.
Oh, I didn't know
And
that.
of course, when I was a kid, I didn't really understand the context for that particularly, but it was, you hear about mines where you go down in a mine shaft, but you explain that this is different. They strip the land, they dig it up, basically. So it's really interesting now because you're talking about the mines and weaving that into how important that was to the economy and the store.
Oh, sure.
It gives a lot more meaning to him just pointing out the window and pointing that
That's
out to
interesting.
me.
I didn't
So
know that he
yeah.
had done that.
Yeah, well,
Well,
I didn't think of it until you were describing all that, and then I was sort of all coming.
Yeah,
That's what's
sure.
neat about having these conversations,
Well, that's good. I didn't know that he had done that. In the early days, um, and probably the earlier part of my life, it was all shaft mines.
Was
And
it?
that's
Okay.
what was dangerous, where you have to go
Yes.
down the shaft, and of course, very little safety regulation. Strip mining came later,
I see.
and it ended up with a lot of swimming holes. And in
Yeah.
recreational areas, there was a little reclamation. They planted a few Christmas
Yes,
trees.
it seems destructive, to the
Oh,
environment.
terribly.
Yeah.
You're ripping the topsoil off
Hmm.
to get to the mine, but you could, with these big buckets, you could get a lot of coal, and it
Yeah.
was uh, it was safer. But then gradually, coal became less. It was still useful, but it was the coal consumption was down some.
And so did it shift from the shaft mining or whatever the name is for that
Yeah,
to strip?
shaft for stripping.
Yeah, so shaft so was that transition because it was easier to get more volume from strip mining
Well, I
or
think the coal was more to the surface they could get at it.
I
And
see.
um, I think that was mainly it. I think some of the
Sure.
shaft mines were very deep. The
Hmm.
interesting outgrowth of that is, for the town, was that United Migrant Workers with John L. Lewis really came into play. It's very, very strong union. So you didn't work in a mine unless you were a United Mine Worker. So whenever a plant or some other kind of business would try to come to Sullivan, they'd hire a bunch of ex-miners. And the miners were used to say, all right, well, we'll just strike. So they'd
Yeah.
try to tell these little startup plants, we're going to strike. So it's very hard to get industry to come because of
Mm-hmm.
the United Mine Workers and the attitude toward employers.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's just a snapshot of all the issues around unions and non-union and all those
Yeah, right.
conflicts that continue. That's like
Well, yes, right. I
a case
mean,
study, basically.
yeah. Well, this had a particular attitude of,
Hmm.
and I suppose it may tie into the trait we were talking about before of not really liking to be told what to do very much.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, the independent streak.
Right,
Yeah. And I think sometimes people who are farmers and used to working the land, or if that's part of the culture, there is sort of that ethos of being very hardy, salt of the earth, working hard, doing it my way.
right. Well, that's
Yeah.
right, independence. Well,
Yeah.
both of my grandparents were, uh, independent.
Hmm.
Grandpa and my dad.
Hmm.
And I think that it had some effect on me. Years later, when I had my own law office, which was the time I really liked to practice the best, people from big firms would say, well, I'd like to do that. I want to open my own office. So I would say to them, well, what do your parents do? And if they would say, well, they've been at Kodak for 30 years, they don't have the mindset to have
Yeah.
their own business because they're used to, being bored but getting paid and
Right.
being told what to do. And the security, I mean,
Yeah,
security
they
and
value stability in a different way.
security and
Yeah.
benefits. So,
Hmm.
but you're not cut out to be on your own if your family
Yeah.
tradition is working for a big corporation.
Yeah, I think I've noticed that too. Or if people have parents who've worked in for, government or that kind of thing, that the stability and consistency is um it they're not as interested in taking risks frequently. Not always the case, but
Oh, and
often
how
the
about
case.
you
Yeah.
when you had your own store? I mean, you follow the
Yeah.
same uh,
Yes.
tradition. Oh, I didn't tell
Yes.
you one thing about a grandpa in the newspaper. He uh, he would trade advertising for cars. So if he needed
Mm.
another car, he'd go in and give them a few years of free advertising
Oh, wow.
in
That's a
his
pretty good deal. Yeah.
newspaper. Unfortunately, his last car, the Packard, finally was just was conking. It was not doing well. In those days, cars didn't last. It was only 10 years old.
Hmm.
But he had to, the family was on to get rid of to get a regular car. And the only place he could get one was Ford. So his last years he drove a Ford. He hated the Ford. A Packard or a Hudson was much more appropriate.
So a Packard and a Hudson were more, did they seem more deluxe? Is that why
Oh
they were
yeah,
more appropriate? Yeah. Okay.
Packard particularly. Packard was top though. Packard was one of the
Got it.
uh, most expensive makes in the country. Uh,
So it'd be analogous to like a Cadillac or something like that.
well, yeah, maybe a Buick. I
Okay.
mean, Packard put out extraordinary cars in the 20s, and they were kind of all the independents by the 1940s and 50s were struggling. I mean, they made it through the
Yeah.
period because of they all went into war production.
Right.
But yeah, Packard was their sales technique slogan was ask the man who owns one.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
They were
Yeah.
they were different. They were a classic car.
Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah, well, in another conversation, maybe we'll talk more about cars, but I think we've been talking for about an hour. So I think
Oh, good. It doesn't seem like it.
we've covered a lot of territory. So I'm going to stop record. Well,
Okay.
thank you for doing this. It was really
Well,
fun and
thank
I
you.
learned a
This has
lot.
been great. By the hour just flew by. That's a lot easier than dictating it.